Jerry Cantrell just released another solo album just 2 years after his previous one. So I want to ask the question, is it any good? I was able to listen to this one a little bit early because I got a promo of it. And my first impression was I was kind of bored. But then after I listened to it for a second time, it started to grow on me. And I think there were a few particular songs on the second half of the album that really stood out. So I'm going to talk about all of that. I'll tell you how it compares to the other solo albums. So let's get into it. So we all know Jerry Cantrell is the singer and guitarist from Alice in Chains, but he also has a solo career, which is not very extensive. It's only 4 albums, and they were really spread apart with the exception of these last 2. His first solo album was Boggy Depot in 1998, which came out about 3 years after the last Alice in Chains album with Lane Staley. Then in 2002, he released Degradation Trip. Then after that, the next solo album didn't come for another 19 years, but also considering he was involved with Alice in Chains with a few of their comeback albums. The previous album was called Brighton. I also reviewed that on my channel. Brighton was a little different than this album. I'll talk about that in a minute because Brighton had more acoustic guitars. It was a bit more country, a little more straightforward rock. This one is darker, and you might expect that from both the album's cover and the title. The music can get a little heavier, a little sludgier. It's slower. There's more texture. And like I said in the beginning, after my first listening, I thought it was kind of boring because it's kind of a gloomy type of album. But then I listened to it again, and it really started to grow on me. I think the first time I listened to it was in the background. I was doing something else. Then the second time was when I started to prepare for this review. I was taking notes, and that was when I started paying attention to the different intricacies that he put into this album. I started to like it a little more. Plus, there were a few songs that were not singles that I felt were the best on the album. He has a few big-name guests on this album. He has Robert Trujillo from Metallica playing bass, and he's on 3 tracks, which are Vilified, Off the Tracks, and It Comes. Duff McKagan of Guns N' Roses plays bass on 3 tracks as well. And I was actually just talking about Duff McKagan on an Ozzy Osbourne video, and I was just noticing that he does a lot of guest work. But Duff McKagan is on 3 other tracks, which are Afterglow, I Want Blood, and Echoes of Laughter. Mike Borden plays drum on I Want Blood and Let It Lie. And if you don't know, he was the Faith No More drummer, and he played with Ozzy also. And actually the 3 people I mentioned played with Ozzy, but that's a whole other story. But he also has Greg Puciato from the Dillinger Escape Plan on 1 track called Echoes of Laughter. And there are a few others, but let me jump into the songs. The first song is Vilified. This was one of the singles, the lead single, I believe. This is probably the most Alice in Chains sounding song on the album. It has lots of grungy guitar effects. I also heard some grunge riffs. He does some distorted vocals in the breakdown. He does some vocals which kind of reminded me of Lane Staley, and the guitar solo sounds like something he would have played on an Alice in Chains album. So basically we're 1 song in and it sounds a little bit more like Alice in Chains as opposed to his previous album, which kind of sounded nothing like that. But let's continue. The next song was Off the Rails. This one also reminded me a little bit of Alice in Chains, mostly in the vocals. The main riff was a little different. It was more goth rock. The song was a little slower moving. The overall tone was sludgier. It had a bigger chorus, the main riff was repetitive, and the guitar solo was simple, but it had melody. So I think Jerry Cantrell as a guitar player is someone who I would compare to David Gilmour. This might be controversial in me saying it, but I'll say it anyway. I compare him to David Gilmour because he's more about feeling and rather than being technical and flashy, so I think that's what I've always liked about his guitar playing. After this is a song called Afterglow, and on the one hand, it was a little bit more upbeat, it had a happier sound, and I felt this one sounded a little more closer to his solo work. But as I was listening to it, I thought the main guitar riff reminded me of that song Whale and Wasp from the Alice in Chains Jar of Flies EP. But that's really the only comparison I would make. Otherwise, it was pretty good. After this is the title track, I Want Blood, and I think the album takes a turn here because this is the first song where he picks up the pace. It's a little faster, a little heavier, a little bit more punk rock and grunge. It definitely had a lot more bass guitar and it had more of a hard driving rhythm. So I think the song stands out on the album because it picks up the pace It's not all just slow and gloomy stuff. After this is a song called Echoes of Laughter. And this is the first song where I hear the acoustic guitars. And I was actually waiting for the acoustic guitars because Jerry Cantrell is known for playing this type of guitar. And I think the last album, Brighton, had more of that on it. But this one's still pretty good. It has a sound similar to some of his other solo albums. Now we're at the part of the album where the magic happens. I think the next batch of songs are kind of unique, where you can hear some different influences, so let's talk about them. There's also one song that stands out amongst them, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The next song is called Throw Me a Line. I think this song has an almost Black Sabbath type of influence. Basically, he took this guitar riff and he repeats it throughout the song. He ends with some wah-wah effects on the guitar, and he plays a different lead guitar melody. I think they go together very well. I found the song to be a little darker and have more of a retro sound. After this is a song called Let It Lie, and this is the song that really caught my attention when I was listening to it for the first time, because for me, it was like a cross between Alice in Chains and Black Sabbath. He was doing these really deep string bends on the guitar. The song was slow, it was doomy, it was sludgy, and even the guitar solo, he even goes harder. So I think this is probably the track that stood out the most, and also probably my favorite track on the album. Then there's a song called Hold Your Tongue. This was interesting because it has an a cappella intro with Jerry singing. I thought that was interesting. You can hear some Alice in Chains influence in this as well. I think this one had a lot more layers of sound. It was a little darker. You can hear Jerry doing a lot of vocal harmonies. But the song took an upbeat turn in the chorus, and I found it to be catchy, almost like a classic rock type of song, so it was a really good one. The last song is called It Comes, and this is another song that's very unique because it is the longest song. It's 6 minutes and 29 seconds. It's a very dark and atmospheric song. He opens with a clean guitar tone, and he's playing these arpeggiated guitar tones, and the drum beat comes in and out of the song very sporadically. You just hear a bass drum here and there, and you might hear one hit of the snare drum, and it builds up, and Jerry starts singing, and he does these droning vocals. Then in the middle of the song, there are more vocal harmonies. This is where it reminds me of Alice in Chains. Then the halfway point, it speeds up, it slows down, then it drones off until the end, where it just ends the song. And it's one of the longer and more epic songs in the album. So I think this was a really good closer. In conclusion, I don't think this is better than the last album, Brighton. I think it's on par with it, where I would say it's just as good. But I will say that both albums are very different, where the first album was, I guess, as the album title alludes to, it's a brighter type of album, a little more acoustic, a little more country, a little more rock. And this album is, like the title says, I Want Blood. So you're getting what you expect. It's bleak, dreary, gloomy, somber. I think, considering that these two albums came out 2 years apart, they're kind of like a pretty cool album pair, where it's kind of like this yin and yang type of thing. So I'll give this the same score I gave the previous album. My score will be an 8 out of 10. So that is all. Let me know what you think of the album. Do you think it's one of his best, or do you think it's just as good as any of his other solo albums? Check out my review of Brighton from 2021. Stick that one right there. Thanks for watching. Please give this video a like. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you have not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.